At 9:40 in the evening, the bell above the door of the copper lantern rang the way it did every night, and the whole room went quiet for half a beat. The man who walked in leaned on a walnut cane with a brass-capped handle, his right leg dragging slightly behind each step. Down here on the Baltimore waterfront, everyone knew exactly who he was. 2 men at the bar paid their tab and left in a hurry. Nobody looked at him directly for more than a second. But the night waitress looked at him for a long time, not out of fear, but because she had been waiting 4 months for him. He came to the counter, his voice low and unhurried. 1 whiskey, no ice, nothing else. Then he carried the glass to table 19 by the window, the table no one else ever sat at, and looked across the street, where an old fire station kept its lights on all night. Exactly 40 minutes later, he laid a $100 bill on the table, picked up his cane, and walked quietly out. Josie came to clear the table and picked up the receipt. The size of the tip wasn't what stopped her. At the bottom, written in careful handwriting, was a single line: "Please don't thank me for anything tonight." And just beneath it, someone had blacked out another line with ink. She tilted the paper toward the light. 3 words still came through. "I didn't." He had tried to erase it. He hadn't erased enough. Josie folded the receipt and slipped it into her apron pocket, along with the 37 others she'd been keeping for the past 4 months. Outside, the man disappeared into the cold, misted street, with no idea at all that the woman who had just cleared his table wasn't there by chance. She had taken this job for a reason, and the name she'd written on her application wasn't her real one. What could make a man who has everything sit in the same chair for 3 years, writing out his own confession every night just to cross it out again? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like so we know you're still here with us. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss the next story about the kindness that still exists in this world. Josie's apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building less than 2 miles from the harbor, and every night she climbed all 42 steps on legs that had already carried her through 8 hours of standing. She opened the door, left the living room dark, and went straight into the bedroom. On the wall across from the bed hung a large wooden board, the only thing in the apartment she dusted every week. It was covered with newspaper clippings yellowed at the edges, a floor plan of the Pier 7 warehouse she had redrawn by hand from the city's public records, a copy of the scene examination report she had requested 3 times before anyone finally gave it to her, a list of the names of everyone present that night, and in the very center, a faded wedding photograph. In the picture, Owen wore his fire department dress uniform and smiled so broadly that his eyes were almost closed. She wore a white dress borrowed from her cousin. They stood on the church steps one June afternoon, neither of them with even $1,000 in the bank, and neither of them caring in the slightest. In the lower right corner of the board, set apart from everything else, was a cream-colored envelope printed with the name of a law office on Charles Street. It had arrived 8 months earlier. It was still sealed, untouched. Josie pulled the wooden chair closer, sat down, and took the receipt from the pocket of her apron, the paper still carrying the sharp, warm scent of a thermal printer. She smoothed it across her lap with the care of someone touching an old wound. Then she took the last red thumbtack from the box and pinned the receipt to the bottom row beside 37 others, exactly like it. 38 receipts. 4 months. That many nights spent standing behind a bar, pouring whiskey for a man the entire harbor district called by different names depending on whether they feared him or owed him money. 3 years earlier, on the night of November 14th, the Pier 7 warehouse caught fire shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning. Engine 19 was the first unit to arrive. 4 hours and 20 minutes later, they carried 2 bags out of the building. One bore the name Nico Marchetti, 24 years old. The other bore the name Owen Bright, 31 years old, firefighter, her husband. The official report was 26 pages long. She had read it so many times that she could recite every paragraph of its conclusion from memory. Electrical failure, flammable materials stored improperly, no evidence of sabotage, accident, no one responsible. Josie didn't believe a single word of it, not because she had proof that said otherwise, but because among those 26 pages, there was one sentence that had kept her awake for 3 years. A sentence buried on page 11 and written in the cold, bloodless language of official procedure. Victim Bright was confirmed to have exited the building at 1:52 in the morning, then returned to the eastern section. He had gotten out. He had already made it out. Then he went back inside. They didn't write why. They didn't need to write why, because to this city, that was a beautiful ending, a hero, a commendation framed in the station hallway, a funeral with brass instruments, and a folded triangular flag placed into the widow's hands. But Josie didn't need a hero. She needed her husband. And for 3 years, she had possessed only one thread to hold on to. The only man who had walked out of that warehouse alive that night was Elias Marchetti. She had tried everything an ordinary person could try. She called the fire department, and they politely invited her to speak with the Public Information Office. She called the police, and they told her the case was closed. She went to the Marchetti family's waterfront office exactly once, and a thick-necked man behind the reception desk told her in a very gentle voice that Mr. Marchetti didn't see anyone without an appointment, then opened the door and held it for her while she left. 4 months earlier, she had heard from an old woman at the laundromat that there was a tavern on the corner of Thames Street where a man with a cane came every night and sat in the same place. That very week, the Copper Lantern posted a notice looking for a night shift waitress. Josie filled out the application in her neatest handwriting. On the line for her full name, she wrote Josephine Larkin, her father's surname, the name she had left behind one June afternoon 7 years earlier and had never imagined she would use again, not because she feared being recognized, but because the name Bright carried an echo in this city, especially in the Harbor District. The moment people heard it, something changed in their eyes. They began choosing their words carefully, and she couldn't uncover the truth from people who were choosing their words carefully. Maud Kavanaugh read her application for exactly 10 seconds, asked whether she could carry a tray with 3 glasses at once, then told her to start the following night. Josie rose from the chair and touched the edge of the wedding photograph, leaving her fingers there for a while. Beyond the window, a ship's horn sounded twice from the bay, long and low, then faded into silence. She reached out and turned off the light. In the darkness, she spoke softly, her voice calm, as though the man she loved were sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for her to tell him about her day. "I'm getting close. His hand has started shaking when he writes." Then she lay down with her eyes still open and thought about the 3 words that had been blacked out on the paper she had just pinned to the wall. I didn't save him, didn't make it in time, didn't dare. For 3 years, she had filled that blank with every terrible possibility a wife could imagine. What she never suspected was that the truth behind those words carried more weight than anything she had ever allowed herself to believe. And when she finally uncovered it, the thing that would shatter wouldn't be the man at table 19, but the very reason she had kept herself alive for the past 3 years. During the 4 months she had spent behind the bar, Josie had memorized that man the way people memorize a song they have heard so many times they are sick of it. At 9:38, the black car stopped a short distance from the tavern, never directly in front of the entrance. At 9:40, the bell above the door rang. He was never early, and never more than a minute late, and Josie had checked the clock often enough to know it wasn't a coincidence. He ordered a whiskey without ice, always the 3rd cheapest bottle on the shelf rather than the most expensive, a detail she didn't notice until the 6th week and couldn't understand. He carried the glass to his reserved table by the window. He sat facing the window, leaving his back exposed to the entire room, a position that, according to everything Josie had ever read about men like him, should never have been allowed. He stayed for exactly 40 minutes. He never took out his phone. He didn't read. He didn't speak to anyone. Some nights the tavern grew so loud that people had to shout into one another's ears. Yet he still sat there in silence, staring across the street as though he were waiting for someone to emerge from the fire station's red rolling door. And not once, not a single time in 4 months, did he order a second drink. Josie recorded every detail in a small notebook hidden beneath the drawer of her bedside table. And the more she wrote, the more uneasy she became, because none of it matched the man she had built in her mind over the past 3 years. The table was the same. No one sat at table 19. There was no sign, no special cloth, and no one had ever given her a single instruction about it. But regular customers walked around it automatically, even on nights when the place was so crowded that people had to stand in the aisle to drink. Once, a pair of tourists started pulling out the chairs, and an old man at the bar merely coughed once and jerked his chin toward them. The couple stood and moved elsewhere without asking why. On Thursday night that week, 2 men at the far end of the bar were arguing about a shipment, their voices rising with every exchange. The bell rang at 9:40. Both men stopped in the middle of a sentence. One pulled out his wallet, left money on the counter without waiting for change, and the 2 of them went out through the back door. Elias never looked their way. He didn't even know they existed. That was what frightened Josie. Not anything he did, but the fact that he didn't need to do anything at all. She waited until he had been seated for about 15 minutes. Her tray held 4 empty glasses she had just cleared from the next table. She walked past table 19, and on the second step, she dragged the toe of her shoe against the table leg, let her body tilt slightly, and released the edge of the tray. The crash made everyone in that corner turn around. All 4 glasses shattered across the wooden floor, pieces skidding as far as the legs of his chair. Josie dropped to her knees at once, reaching out, and in that moment, she didn't look at the floor. She looked at his face, because that was what she needed. She needed to see him flinch. She needed to see him frown, to see irritation, to catch some flicker of the man who had walked out of the fire while her husband had not. But he didn't flinch. He set his glass down very slowly, placed one hand on the edge of the chair, wrapped the other around the head of his cane, and began to lower himself. His right leg wouldn't bend with him. Josie saw everything. She saw his shoulders tighten, saw him shift his weight onto his left leg, saw his knuckles turn white against the wooden chair as he lowered himself inch by inch, and she saw the moment stretch long enough that anyone else would have given up and called someone over to do it for them. He didn't call anyone. He made it to the floor, and he didn't pick up the piece closest to his hand. He reached across, around the front of her knee, and first picked up the longest shard, the one with a thin beveled edge like a blade lying less than a hand's width from her fingers. He laid it across his palm with the sharp edge facing down, then gathered the remaining pieces. Josie stayed still. Something inside her chest slipped loose from the place where it had been holding. For 3 years, she had built this man from newspaper clippings and official reports, and in that construction, he had been a shadow, a name, something that had taken away what mattered most to her, and then gone on living. That shadow didn't have a ruined knee. That shadow didn't need 4 seconds to lower himself to the floor. That shadow certainly didn't care whether a waitress cut her hand. He collected every shard into his palm, placed them neatly on the tray, then gripped the chair and rose, and Josie saw him clench his teeth for exactly half a second, before his expression returned to calm. She stood as well, holding the tray against her chest like a shield. She said thank you, and even to her own ears, her voice sounded strange. He gave a single nod, sat down again, lifted his whiskey, and turned back toward the window as though nothing had happened. The entire exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. Josie carried the tray into the kitchen, emptied the broken glass into the bin, and stood there for a long time with both hands braced against the edge of the sink. She had come there to prove something. That night, for the first time in 4 months, she realized she was no longer certain whether she was searching for evidence or searching for a reason to keep hating him. The following night, Josie couldn't sleep. She sat up at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, removed all 38 receipts from the wooden board, carried them into the living room, and began arranging them by date. She didn't know what she was looking for. She only knew that from the moment she had seen that man's hand reach around the front of her knee to pick up the sharpest shard of glass, something inside her had slipped out of its old place, and she needed to find a way to pin it back down. She arranged the receipts in 4 long rows across the wooden floor, 1 row for each month, then crouched among them like a child sitting in the middle of a scattered puzzle. The same sentence, "Please don't thank me for anything tonight." 38 times. The same handwriting, the same place on the paper, the same distance from the lower edge, and beneath it, every single time, another line had been covered completely in black ink. She had examined them under the desk lamp dozens of times, had even tried holding the paper at a narrow angle, and on a few fortunate receipts, she had managed to make out only 3 words. But that night, she didn't hold them up to the light. That night, she leaned back and looked at all 4 rows at once. And what struck her wasn't the writing, but the color. In every row, there was exactly 1 receipt darker than all the others. It wasn't darker because more had been written. It was darker because the pen had been pressed down so hard that the ink had spread into a thick stain, and on 2 of them, the tip had scraped through the surface of the paper and left a white scar. Josie crawled closer and turned each receipt over to read the date printed in the upper corner. The first was dated July 14th, the second, August 14th, the third, September 14th, the fourth, October 14th. She sat perfectly still. Outside the window, a garbage truck passed, its engine rumbling below before fading toward the end of the street, and in the silence that followed, Josie could hear her pulse beating against both temples. November 14th, the night the Pier 7 warehouse caught fire. the night 2 bags were carried out. For 3 years, whenever the calendar reached that same numbered day, the man at table 19 had written the same sentence he wrote every other night, but his hand had failed him. Josie covered her mouth. Not because she felt sorry for him. She wasn't ready for that word. But because for 3 years she had been certain she was the only person in the city still counting the days. She had believed all of Baltimore had moved on long ago, that the name Owen Bright had become nothing more than a brass plaque in the station hallway, something people passed every day without bothering to look at. It turned out someone else had been counting too, and that person was the very man she had come there to accuse. The next evening, she arrived at work earlier than usual. At 9:40, the bell above the door rang. Elias ordered a whiskey without ice, carried it to table 19, sat down, and looked out the window. Josie stood behind the bar and never took her eyes off his hand when he drew out the pen and began to write. The hand was steady. It was the 21st. 40 minutes later, he left. Josie went to clear the table, picked up the receipt, and instead of slipping it directly into her apron pocket as she always did, she carried it into the kitchen, placed it on the steel counter beside the sink, took out her phone, and switched on the flashlight, angling the light across the paper so she could photograph the black streak of ink. She was taking the third picture when she heard a soft cough behind her. Maud Kavanaugh stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, and Josie had no idea how long she had been there. Josie couldn't think of a single thing to say. She simply straightened, the phone still glowing in her hand, the receipt still lying on the steel counter between them, and waited. She waited to be fired. She waited to be asked who she really was. Maud came closer, looked down at the paper for exactly 2 seconds, then reached out and placed a hand around Josie's wrist. Her hand was dry, warm, and heavier than Josie had expected. She didn't snatch away the receipt. She didn't look at the phone. She simply held Josie's wrist there and spoke in the calm voice of a woman who had seen too much during 30 years behind a bar. Find whatever it is you came here to find. Just don't find the wrong thing. Josie felt her heart miss a beat. She asked what Maud knew. Maud released her wrist, picked up the cleaning cloth, and began wiping the steel counter slowly, as though the question wasn't important enough to make her stop. She said she had opened the tavern before Josie was born, that she had seen every kind of man sit at that table by the window, men crying because their wives had left them, men laughing because they had won the lottery, men who sat there one night and never came back the following week. Then she stopped wiping, looked directly at Josie, and said the thing Josie would remember for the rest of her life. 3 years. Not one night missed. Not even Christmas Eve. Not even the night of the storm last February when the entire harbor district lost power and I had to light candles. He still came. He still sat in that exact place. He still drank in the darkness for exactly 40 minutes, then went home. Maud folded the cloth, hung it on its hook, and before leaving the kitchen, added one more sentence in a voice so soft that Josie almost didn't hear it. People only do something that faithfully when they're paying a debt, dear. Who he owes, I don't know. Josie stood alone in the kitchen, the receipt still lying on the steel counter beneath the white light. 3 years. Not one night missed. And suddenly she understood something that sent a chill down her spine. If that man came there every night to stare across the street at the fire station, then in all those 3 years, he had never once crossed the road and gone inside. Maud's words stayed in Josie's mind for days afterward, and they made her do something she couldn't explain even to herself. She began noticing things that had nothing to do with her investigation. She noticed that he always turned the glass 3 times against the tabletop before taking his first sip. She noticed that he never sat down until he had leaned his cane against the side of the chair at exactly the same angle, the brass-capped end facing outward, as though that position meant something. She noticed that whenever the tavern played its music loudly, he drank about 5 minutes faster and left early. She wrote all of it in the notebook beneath the bedside drawer, and every time she put pen to paper, unease rose inside her, because those lines no longer looked like the notes of someone building a case against a man. They looked like the notes of someone trying to understand him. The 41st night was a Tuesday, the tavern nearly empty, a fine rain drifting against the windows. At 9:40, the bell rang. His usual drink, his usual corner. Josie stood behind the bar polishing glasses and counting each minute in her head out of habit. But that night, there was one difference. He didn't take out his pen at the 35th minute as he always did. He took it out the moment he sat down, wrote without stopping, then folded the paper in half and placed it neatly in the center of the table. Not near the edge, not beside the glass, but directly in the middle. Only then did he pick up his drink. 40 minutes later, he set down the money, took his cane, and before walking through the door, he paused for half a second and looked toward the bar. It wasn't a passing glance. He looked straight at her. Then he left. Josie remained still until the sound of the bell had completely faded. Only 3 customers remained in the far corner. She walked to table 19, and she would always remember that her hand trembled when she picked up the paper. She unfolded it. There was no black stain of ink, no crossed-out line, no familiar sentence. There was only a single line, written in the same handwriting, calm as a note left on a kitchen table. Mrs. Bright, if you're going to take any more, take the whole stack and save yourself the trouble. Josie read it a second time, then a third. The name Bright lay there, carefully capitalized, with no question mark, no threat, nothing at all. She heard the glass washer running in the kitchen, and the rain tapping against the window, and she realized she was still standing in the middle of the tavern, with the paper in her hand, unable to remember how long she had been there. He knew. He hadn't only found out that week. He hadn't discovered it the night she dropped the tray of glasses. Josie thought back over the entire 4 months, and everything began arranging itself into a different order, an order that sent a chill down her spine. How long had he known? Had he known from the very first night she carried his whiskey to that table, when she still hadn't dared to look directly into his face? Had he known even before she applied for the job? How long would it take a man with an entire office on the docks and a line of people waiting outside his hallway to learn the identity of the new night shift waitress at the tavern where he sat every evening? Perhaps one day, perhaps one afternoon, and for 4 months, knowing who she was, knowing she was stealing every receipt he left behind, he had still come. He had still sat in that exact place. He had still written that sentence, and then blacked it out with his own hand, night after night, directly in front of Owen Bright's wife. Josie folded the paper, slipped it into her apron pocket, and finished her shift like a machine. She washed glasses. She wiped tables. She counted the money in the register, and through all of it, only one question repeated itself inside her. Not why he knew, but why he had said nothing. Why hadn't he sent someone to knock on her door at 2 o'clock in the morning? Why hadn't he said a word to Maud so she would lose her job the following night? Why had he allowed a woman carrying 3 years of hatred to stand 4 steps away from him every evening, then carefully reminded her that she could take the whole stack and save herself the trouble? The next night, at 9:40, the bell didn't ring. Josie had poured a whiskey without ice at 9:38 and set it on the bar in the place where she always left it. 9:50. 10 o'clock. 10:30. The drink remained there, and she passed it more times than she could count that night. At the end of her shift, she picked it up, stood before the sink for a while, then poured it away. The second night was the same. So was the third. For 3 nights in a row, she poured it at the same time, placed it in the same spot, and emptied it at the end of the shift. She told herself it was only a habit of the hands. She told herself she needed him to return because she still hadn't gotten what she came for. But on the third night, as she watched the amber liquor stream down the drain, she realized that neither reason was true, and she didn't dare think any further about the third one. Maud stepped into the kitchen and found her standing there with the empty glass in her hand. She didn't ask why the whiskey had been poured every night. She had watched it happen for 3 evenings. She merely leaned against the doorframe, folded her arms, and asked very softly, "Who are you pouring that for?" "Josie." Josie opened her mouth. She meant to say it was for a customer. She meant to say she had poured it by mistake. She meant to say anything at all. But all 3 answers died in her throat, because the only image in her mind was the man's hand reaching around the front of her knee to pick up the sharpest shard of broken glass. She couldn't answer. Maud nodded as though that silence was the answer she had been waiting for, then turned away. On the 4th night, Josie arrived at the tavern an hour early. She wiped table 19, even though it was already clean. She poured the whiskey at 9:38, and this time, the bell rang. He came in at 9:41, 1 minute later than he had for the past 3 years, and Josie noticed that before she even noticed his face. He was paler than usual, his cheeks hollowed, and the cane struck the wooden floor more heavily, more slowly, as though the distance from the door to table 19 had somehow become twice as long as on every other night. He didn't come to the bar to order his drink. He went straight to the table, sat down, and placed a brown paper envelope on the tabletop, so thick it couldn't be folded. Josie brought him the whiskey. She had poured it at 9:38, just as she had on the previous 3 nights, and she didn't know whether she should feel relieved or afraid. She set the glass down. He didn't touch it. He pushed the envelope toward her, exactly halfway across the table, then withdrew his hand. In the same deep, measured voice he always used, he said that she had spent 4 months collecting 38 pieces of paper that told her nothing, and that it had been a waste of both their time. Josie stood there holding the tray against her chest. She asked what was inside. He said it was his file. She sat down in the chair across from him, the chair no one had occupied in 4 months, and opened the envelope right there, in the middle of the tavern, her hands trembling so badly that she had to rest both elbows on the table to keep the stack of papers from sliding away. There were more than 200 pages inside. A copy of the scene examination report, the complete version, not the shortened public version she had requested 3 times before finally receiving. A structural diagram of the Pier 7 warehouse redrawn by an independent engineer. Statements from 11 people, typed, signed, dated, with the faint name of a private investigative office in Philadelphia printed at the bottom of every page. Some of the statements were dated only 2 weeks after the fire. Others were dated just 4 months earlier. 3 years. This man had spent 3 years, and an unknown amount of money, paying people to question every witness again, in a case the city had closed and called an accident. Josie turned the pages quickly, her fingers running along the corners, and she knew paperwork well enough to notice when the rhythm broke. She turned back. Page 39. Page 40. Then page 44. She checked again, more slowly this time, examining the bound edge beneath the hanging light. 3 pages had been removed. They hadn't fallen out. They hadn't been left out during printing. They had been taken by a steady hand, and whoever had done it hadn't even bothered to renumber the pages to hide the fact. Josie looked up. She asked where pages 41, 42, and 43 were. He didn't avoid her eyes. He didn't deny it. Didn't say she was mistaken. Didn't suggest that perhaps the copier had jammed. He simply picked up the whiskey, turned the glass 3 times on the tabletop in the habit she had come to know by heart, and told her to read everything, from the first page to the last. Don't skip a page. Don't stop on the page where you want to stop. Then you'll know for yourself what's missing. Josie said she didn't understand. She asked why he had given her the rest of the file if he intended to keep those 3 pages. He looked out the window, across the street, where the red rolling door of engine 19 was closed, and the light above the station number still burned as it did every night. He said there was enough in that file to answer the question she had carried for 3 years. It would tell her what her husband had done that night, what time he had done it, and who had seen him. The missing part, he said, wasn't the part that answered her question. It was the part that answered his. Josie remained silent for a long time. Then she asked the question she had meant to ask from the moment she opened the envelope. She asked why. She told him plainly that the file contained things which, if she took them to the right place, could reopen the case. People would come knocking at his waterfront office. Reporters would wait outside. He knew who she was. He knew why she had come there. So why had he placed something in her hands that could destroy him? Elias turned back toward her, and Josie saw something in his eyes she had never seen during the 4 months she had watched him. Something that wasn't coldness and wasn't defense. It was closer to relief than anything else. He said he had sat at that table for 3 years, and every night he had thought that perhaps today someone would walk through the door. He said he hadn't known who it would be. An investigator, a reporter, someone from the station across the street, or someone from the family. 3 years, he said, was a very long time to wait for a person whose face you didn't know. Then he finished the whiskey left in his glass in one swallow, something he had never done in all the 4 months she had stood behind the bar watching him drink. He set the glass down, braced one hand against the edge of the table, and stood, and Josie saw that it took him a moment before he could straighten fully. He spoke one last sentence before picking up his cane. He said the person who finally walked in turned out to be her, and that somehow made more sense than anything else. He didn't explain further. He went out the door, the bell rang once, and the street beyond swallowed him. Josie remained alone at table 19, with more than 200 pages before her, and an empty space where 3 pages should have been. She lowered her eyes to the first page, and in that moment she knew that by the time she reached the last, she would no longer be the woman who had walked into that tavern 4 months earlier. Josie took the file home and didn't open it. It lay on the kitchen table for 2 days, the brown envelope torn open along one edge, and every time she walked past it, her heart missed a beat before she forced herself to keep moving. She told herself she needed an entire evening to read it. The truth was that she was afraid. For 3 years, that stack of papers had been the thing she wanted more than anything else in the world, and now it was sitting right there. And she discovered that a person could desperately want to know the truth and still fear it so deeply that she couldn't bring herself to open the first page. She returned to the tavern on the third night with a small decision she couldn't explain even to herself. At 9:40, the bell rang, and when she carried the whiskey to table 19, she set down a steaming bowl of potato and bacon soup beside it, something the kitchen always made too much of on Tuesday nights. Elias looked at the bowl, then up at her. He said he hadn't ordered it. She said that was right. He hadn't. It was on the house. He said he would pay for it. She said he didn't need to. He said he did. She smiled and told him he looked too pale, and pale people weren't allowed to argue with the person bringing them food. He didn't argue. He finished the entire bowl, and when he stood to leave, he placed another bill beside the usual $100, perfectly flat, its corners straight, as carefully as though he were signing a contract. Josie looked at the 2 bills and felt something pinch inside her chest, something both amusing and irritating. The following night, after he hung his coat on the hook beside the table and went to wash his hands, she passed by with a tray in her hands, and with the quick, practiced movement of someone who had carried dishes for 8 hours a night over 4 months, she slipped the extra $100 bill into his coat pocket. She returned behind the bar, polished a glass, and pretended not to look in his direction. 10 minutes later, she saw him pause almost imperceptibly as he put on his coat, his hand stopping at the right pocket. He didn't turn around. He didn't say anything. He simply walked to the bar, tapped the brass tip of his cane once against the floor, and ordered a bottle of water. Josie opened the refrigerator, took out the bottle, set it on the counter, and told him the price. He handed her that exact $100 bill. She said she didn't have enough change. He said he didn't need any. Then he took the bottle of water, carried it to table 19, set it down, and never opened it. The bottle remained untouched on the table for the full 40 minutes, and when he left, it was still sitting there, with the seal intact. Josie stared at it for a long time, biting her lip to keep from laughing in the middle of the tavern. The night after that, she arrived for her shift, and found 4 $100 bills stacked neatly on the bar beside the glass tip jar, every edge aligned perfectly, with a paper napkin folded into quarters underneath them. She opened it. There was a single line written in the handwriting she had come to know by heart. "Don't make me drink 4 more bottles of water." Josie stood in the middle of the tavern with the note in her hand and laughed out loud for the first time in 3 years. She laughed so hard that she had to turn her face toward the glass cabinet. Maud came out of the kitchen, still carrying a basket of potatoes, looked at the 4 bills on the counter, then at Josie, and shook her head. She said she had owned that tavern for 30 years, and had watched people argue over women, football, shipments, and parking spaces, but she had never seen 2 grown adults fight over which one was allowed to keep the money. She said it loudly enough for everyone in the corner to hear. Josie's face turned red, and at that exact moment, the bell above the door rang. 9:40. Elias stepped inside, heard the last half of Maud's sentence, and stopped in the middle of the aisle. Josie turned toward him, still holding the paper napkin, while the $400 bills lay exposed on the counter like evidence. For 1 second, no one said anything. Then the corner of his mouth lifted. It was slight, brief, almost too quick to catch, but it drew the lines around his eyes with it, and his entire face changed. The face on which Josie had seen only one expression for 4 months, which was no expression at all. In the same deep, measured voice, he said she was making this very difficult. She said she had heard that before. He said no, she hadn't heard it from him. Then he walked toward table 19, and Josie remained behind the bar, and it took her several seconds to realize that her cheeks felt tight because she was smiling too. She turned her back, pretending to rearrange the glasses on the shelf, and told herself that this was nothing more than an innocent joke between a waitress and a difficult customer. But that night, while wiping down table 19 after closing, she stopped halfway through, the cloth still in her hand. She remembered that throughout the entire evening, she hadn't thought even once about the file lying on her kitchen table, and she didn't know whether that meant she was beginning to forget, or whether she was beginning to betray a man who was no longer there to object. After the night of the $400 bills, something small began to change in Josie's shift, though she never announced it to anyone. Every evening at 7 o'clock, while the tavern was still quiet, She walked over to table 19, wiped the surface, even though it was already clean, pulled both chairs into their proper places, and left them there. She didn't put up a reserved sign. She didn't say anything to Maud. She simply stopped seating anyone there, even on Friday nights when the tavern was so crowded that people had to stand and drink in the aisle leading to the restrooms. She told herself it was nothing more than professional habit, that when a table belonged to a regular customer, you kept it for them, and there was nothing unusual about that. But one night, while rain fell heavily outside, a middle-aged man who had just raised a glass with his friends at the bar walked straight over and pulled out a chair to sit down. Josie reached the table before she had time to think about what she was doing. She told him the table was taken. The man looked up, glanced around the completely empty tabletop, then laughed and said he didn't see any sign. Josie said that was right. He didn't, but someone would come looking for it. The man studied her for a moment, then looked toward Maud behind the bar, and Maud merely raised one eyebrow without saying a word. He stood, picked up his drink, and returned to the bar without asking another question. Josie remained beside the empty table, one hand still resting on the back of the chair, and suddenly realized that her heart was beating fast, not because of the confrontation with the customer, but because she had heard herself say those words, and they hadn't sounded like the words of a waitress simply doing her job. They had sounded like the words of someone saving a place for another person. At 9:40, the bell above the door rang. Elias walked in, saw the empty table in the middle of a tavern packed with people, and paused for half a beat. He didn't say anything. He sat down, leaned his cane against the chair at its familiar angle, and when Josie brought him his whiskey, he said thank you. Only those 2 words, but he said them in a way that made her understand he knew what had happened, and perhaps had known for several weeks. The tavern closed early that night because of the rain. By nearly 10 o'clock, he was the only person left in that corner of the room. Josie carried the coffee pot over and refilled the cups of the last 2 customers at the bar, then stopped beside table 19 and asked him the question she had been carrying in her mind for 4 months. She asked whether she could ask him something. He said she already had. Josie laughed, a brief sound, and she was surprised she could still laugh at a moment like this. Then she asked why this table. Why, in a tavern with 18 tables, did he sit at table 19 every single night? Elias didn't answer immediately. He turned the glass once against the tabletop, then twice, then stopped. And Josie had already begun to regret asking. She said she was sorry, that he didn't have to answer. But he didn't look at her. He turned his head to the left and gazed through the rain-streaked window toward the other side of the street, where the red rolling door of the fire station had just risen and the ladder truck was backing inside, its roof lights still turning slowly after a nighttime call. In a voice as calm as though he were speaking about the weather, he said it was because the truck across the street carried that number. Josie reached for the back of the chair. She had to hold on, because for one moment the room tilted around her. She had read that number so many times in the 26-page report that it had been burned into her vision. She had heard it on the news that night while standing barefoot in her kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning, still holding the ringing telephone. She had seen it on the brass plaque outside the station on the day of the funeral, when they folded the flag into a triangle and placed it in her hands. Engine 19. For 4 months, she had stood 4 steps away from this man every night and believed he sat there to remember his younger brother, that the table was some private superstition, a lucky number, a familiar corner. It wasn't. For 3 years, he had chosen the only table in the tavern that looked directly toward that door. He didn't sit there because of his own family. He sat there to look across at her husband's station. Josie opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She realized she was gripping the chair so tightly that her knuckles had gone numb. Across the street, the rolling door lowered again. The light above the station number remained on, and its glow reflected against the glass in a faint red streak that stretched across table 19 between them. Elias didn't offer another word of explanation. He finished his whiskey, set down the money, took his cane, and rose. And before turning away, he only said that the rain was heavy and she should be careful going home. The bell rang. Josie remained alone beside the table, and for the first time in 4 months, she sat down in his chair. She looked outside in exactly the direction he had looked every night, 40 minutes each evening, without missing a single night in 3 years. From that place, she could see the entire front of the fire station, the door, the brightly lit second-floor window where the duty crew sat, and even the small brass plaque mounted to the left of the entrance, the one she knew carried her husband's name. And in her mind, A new question appeared, one that sent a colder chill through her spine than anything she had discovered before. If he had spent 3 years sitting there and looking across the street, why hadn't he crossed it even once? That question followed Josie for days, and it made her do something she never would have done 4 months earlier. She began taking the long way home through the harbor. She told herself that route was better lit, safer for a woman leaving work at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. The truth was that she wanted to see the rest of that man's life, the part that existed beyond the 40 minutes each night she had come to know by heart. On the 4th night, as she passed the row of old warehouses at the end of Thames Street, she saw a window still glowing. It wasn't the cold white light of a warehouse lamp. It was the warm golden glow of a low-hanging bulb, spilling through the small square pane in a wooden door. And there were voices inside. Josie stopped. She stood on the opposite sidewalk for nearly a minute, then crossed the street, and through that pane she saw something that rooted her to the ground. Inside was a woodworking shop. It wasn't large, only about the size of 2 living rooms joined together, with sawdust covering the floor, 4 rows of workbenches arranged in a rectangle, and curved wooden frames waiting to be assembled hanging all across the walls. In the center of the shop stood the half-finished skeleton of a small boat, and at the workbench nearest the door, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, stood Elias Marchetti. His cane leaned against the leg of the bench more than an arm's reach away, as though inside that room he didn't need it very often. He was holding the hand of a man in his 40s, guiding him as he pushed a plane along the grain of the wood, and he said something that made the man laugh and shake his head. Josie counted 9 people in the shop. 2 were young men still wearing the protective jackets of a cargo handling company. Dust streaked across their shoulders. A silver-haired woman sat at the last table, sanding a piece of board. A middle-aged man had a pair of crutches propped beside his chair, and on the coat draped over its back, Josie saw the insignia of the Baltimore Fire Department. She swallowed hard. Then she heard children laughing. In the far right corner of the shop, well away from all the machinery, 2 children around 9 or 10 years old were arguing over a wooden ruler. One insisted the board measured 3 handspans, while the other said it didn't, that it had to be 3.5, and both turned to call Uncle Elias over to settle the matter. He walked across, examined the board with the solemn expression of a man reviewing a contract, then declared that both of them were wrong, and the piece of wood was exactly 3 1/4 handspans long. Both children protested loudly. He told them that next time they should remember to bring their own ruler. Then he reached up to a shelf, took down 2 wooden boats small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, their hulls polished smooth, and their white cloth sails cut into perfect squares, and gave one to each child. They cried out with delight. They ran around the shop, showing them to every adult there, then dropped onto the sawdust-covered floor and began arguing over whose boat would stay afloat longer when they launched them from the pier the next morning. The entire shop erupted in laughter. The man with the crutches called out that every boat could float. It was only grown people who had a habit of sinking. Elias returned to his workbench without saying anything, but Josie saw the corner of his mouth. She stood there with one hand pressed against the cold glass, and she couldn't remember how long she had been watching. Then the door opened. The silver-haired woman stepped outside to smoke, saw her, and assumed she was a new student. She told Josie to come in, that the class was never closed, and anyone could join. Josie asked how much the lessons cost. The woman looked at her as though she had asked a very strange question, then said there was no fee and there never had been. She added that her son worked on the docks, had broken his back 2 years earlier, and spent 4 months at home refusing to leave his room, and now he was sitting right over there at the second table. Then she stepped outside. Josie pushed open the door and entered. The scent of sawdust and varnish rushed over her. Elias looked up and saw her. He didn't appear surprised, and he didn't look annoyed, and somehow that unsettled her more than either reaction would have. She said she had been passing by. He said he knew that this was the 4th night that week she had passed by. Josie's face grew warm. She asked why he didn't charge anyone, not even for the wood. Elias set the plane on the bench, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked around the shop, at the man with the crutches, at the 2 children sitting on the floor, at the unfinished boat frame in the middle of the room. Then he said this craft had kept him alive. He said that 3 years earlier there had been a time when he hadn't left the house or spoken to anyone, and the only thing that pulled him out of bed each morning was knowing he had to finish building the ribs of a boat. He said it had saved him, so perhaps it might save someone else too. He said it plainly, without emphasis, then picked up the plane and returned to his work as though he had merely been talking about the price of lumber. Josie remained near the door. She felt her chest tighten, and she didn't understand why. She had prepared herself for many things when she began this investigation. She had prepared for lies, for doors slammed in her face, for coldness, even for danger. She had never prepared herself to stand in a workshop filled with sawdust and children's laughter, and realize that the man she had come to accuse was quietly mending the people this city had forgotten, in the same way he mended broken boat frames. She turned toward the door and walked quickly back to the street, and she had to draw a deep breath in the cold night air before breathing became easier. That was why she didn't look closely at the wooden shelf immediately to the right of the entrance, where a framed photograph lay face down. She returned to the workshop on Saturday night the following week, and this time she didn't remain outside the door. She told herself she had come to demand an answer about the 3 missing pages, that this was her chance to see him in a place where he didn't have table 19 to hide behind. But when she pushed open the door and stepped inside, the first thing she did wasn't ask questions. She took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and when the silver-haired woman handed her a sheet of sandpaper and a piece of wood, she accepted them. There were only 4 people in the workshop that night. The 2 children had gone home with their father that afternoon. The man with the crutches sat at the last table, telling some story that made the entire room laugh. Josie sanded for nearly an hour, and she was surprised to feel her shoulders slowly begin to loosen, surprised that the steady rasp of sandpaper against wood soothed something inside her mind that 3 years of sleeping pills had never been able to touch. Near 11 o'clock, Elias said he was going into the storeroom to get a set of replacement chisels, then took his cane and walked toward the small door at the far end of the workshop. Josie stood and stretched, then moved along the row of wooden shelves against the right wall, the same shelves she had passed without looking the first time. They held the things that belonged to a craftsman: boxes of brass nails sorted by size, a coil of hemp rope, several wooden bending forms, an old oil lamp, and midway along the shelf, a small wooden picture frame lay face down against the wood. Josie reached for it, then pulled her hand back. Then she reached out again and turned it over. The photograph showed 2 men standing on the deck of a small wooden boat, the bay behind them glittering in the sunlight. The man on the left was Elias, much younger, standing firmly on both legs like anyone else, without a cane. His hair wet, one hand gripping the anchor line, and laughing with his mouth open in a way Josie had never seen on that face, and could hardly believe it had once been capable of. The man on the right was younger, half a head shorter, with one arm draped across his brother's shoulders in the easy posture of a younger sibling accustomed to being indulged. And his face had been blacked out, not with a careless line drawn across it. Someone had gone over it again and again with a black marker, pressing so hard that the ink shone and the surface of the photograph had buckled into fine wrinkles. People only covered something that way when they wanted what lay beneath it to disappear completely. Josie held the frame in both hands and stood perfectly still. She had read that name in the report so many times that she knew it by heart. Nico Marchetti, 24 years old, one of the 2 bags carried out of the warehouse on the night of November 14th. But for 3 years, that name had been nothing more to her than a line printed beside the line bearing her husband's name, a number in a record of losses, a reason people called the fire a tragedy for both sides. She had never thought of him as a younger brother, with his arm around his older brother's shoulders on the deck of a boat beneath an afternoon sun. She stared at the black stain of ink, and in her mind she saw the lines covered over on the 38 receipts pinned to the wall of her bedroom, the same kind of ink, the same hand, the same pressure, hard enough to tear the surface of the paper. This man didn't erase the things he wanted to forget. He erased the things he couldn't forgive himself for. The storeroom door opened at the far end of the workshop. Josie set the frame down, placing it face down exactly as she had found it. She returned to her table, picked up the sandpaper, and when Elias passed behind her carrying the box of chisels, she didn't ask a single question. She had prepared 3 of them in her mind before entering the workshop that night, and she swallowed all 3. Some questions had to wait until a person was ready, not until someone else's curiosity demanded an answer. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, she reached her apartment. She didn't turn on the living room light. She went straight into the bedroom, stood before the wooden board with the 38 receipts pinned in 4 rows, and looked at them for a long time. Then she turned, opened the bottom drawer of the bedside table, and reached inside. Beneath a stack of handkerchiefs and an old savings book lay another picture frame. She had put it there during the 2nd week after the funeral, when she discovered she couldn't change her clothes in a room where Owen was watching her with that smile. She hadn't opened the drawer once in 3 years. Josie took out the frame, wiped away the dust with her sleeve, then sat on the edge of the bed and placed it across her lap. Owen in his dress uniform, smiling so broadly that his eyes were nearly closed. Josie in the white dress borrowed from her cousin, the church steps on a June afternoon. She sat that way for a long time, and she didn't cry. She only touched her thumb lightly to the face in the photograph and left it there. In her mind, the two pictures lay beside each other. One had been hidden in a drawer because someone couldn't bear to look at it. The other had been blacked out because someone couldn't bear to be looked at by it. And for the first time in 3 years, Josie understood that both things were the same, differing only in who had been left alive to hold the pen. She placed the photograph on top of the bedside table, facing outward, instead of returning it to the drawer. Then she went to the kitchen table, where the brown envelope had remained untouched in the same place for more than a week. She pulled out a chair, sat down, removed the stack of papers, opened it to the first page, and began to read. She read from 1 o'clock in the morning until the sky began to brighten. The first 30 pages contained things she already knew, only in fuller and colder detail. The structure of the roof, the placement of the cargo crates, the speed at which the fire spread measured in feet per minute, the time the alarm was raised, the time the first engine arrived. From page 31 onward came the witness statements, the night security guard, the tanker truck driver, an emergency dispatch operator. Josie read every word, tracing each line with her finger, and her pace slowed as the page numbers drew closer to 40. Because a clear and terrible certainty had begun to form inside her that the thing she feared most was waiting there. Page 40 contained the statement of a man named Rusty Halloran, a firefighter with Engine 19, first interviewed 4 days after the fire and questioned again 10 months earlier. Josie knew that name. He had come to her house after the funeral, stood in the doorway holding his cap in both hands, managed to say exactly 3 sentences, then left. In the written statement, his voice was entirely different. He testified that at 1:52 in the morning, he had been holding a hose at the southeast corner when he saw 2 men emerge from the gap between 2 burning stacks of cargo. One wore civilian clothes and could barely walk, while the other was almost dragging him out. The second man wore department turnout gear, and once they cleared the smoke, Halloran recognized him as Owen Bright. He went on to say that he shouted to Owen, motioned toward the ambulance, and Owen saw him, looked directly at him. Then Owen lowered the other man onto the concrete for 2 paramedics running toward them, straightened, turned his head toward the warehouse entrance, and ran back inside. Rusty Halloran testified that he shouted Owen's name at least 3 times. He testified that no order had come over the radio at that moment, that there had been no report of anyone still trapped inside, no one directing him, no one pushing him, no one asking him to go. On the final line of the statement, underlined in ink in the original document, the investigator had recorded Halloran's exact words. He went back in on his own. No one told him to do it. Josie read that passage 4 times. Then she set the file down on the kitchen table and sat perfectly still with both hands covering her face. Outside, somewhere toward the bay, a seabird cried. For 3 years, the thing that had kept her standing was a very simple story she had repeated to herself every night. A wealthy and powerful man had been trapped in the fire. He had somehow forced her husband to go back for him, and then he had survived while her husband had not. In that story, someone was guilty, and as long as someone was guilty, she still had work to do, still had somewhere to place her anger, still had a reason to get out of bed. Now Rusty Halloran had taken that story from her with a single sentence. No one told him to do it. She turned to the next page. Page 44. She had already known what she would find, but she checked again anyway, examining the bound edge beneath the kitchen light, turning the stack so she could be certain. 3 pages. 41, 42, and 43. They came immediately after the testimony of the man who had watched Owen turn back, and immediately before the next statement. Josie read the remaining 160 pages over the following 2 days, searching them the way someone searches for a key in a room that has already been searched from wall to wall. There was nothing else. Not one page explained why a firefighter who had reached safety would choose to run back into a collapsing building. On the 3rd night, she waited until nearly 11 o'clock, when only 3 customers remained at the bar, and Maud had gone into the kitchen to check inventory. Elias was still sitting at table 19, his whiskey only half finished. Josie walked over and placed the entire 200-page file on the table in front of him, with more force than she intended. He looked up. She said she had read all of it, from the first page to the last, without skipping a single one, exactly as he had told her. She said she knew her husband had made it outside, and then gone back in of his own free will. She said she knew no one had ordered him, no one had pushed him, no one had called for him. Her voice began to tremble, and she couldn't control it anymore. Then she placed both hands on the table, leaned down, looked directly into his eyes, and asked the question she had carried inside herself for 3 years, but had only now learned how to ask correctly. "What did you say to my husband before he went back inside?" Elias didn't answer. He looked at her, and Josie saw something pass across his face, swift and fleeting, like a door opening a crack and closing again. She stood there waiting. A car passed outside, its headlights sweeping across the window before disappearing. At the bar, someone burst into laughter at some story, and the sound seemed impossibly distant, as though it came from another world. Josie waited long enough to understand that he wasn't going to answer. Softly, almost pleading, she said that he had placed the file in her hands himself, that he had told her to read every page, and that he owed her only one sentence. Elias raised a hand to the head of his cane. He braced himself against the edge of the table and stood slowly, and Josie saw his knuckles turn white. He didn't touch the whiskey. He took out his wallet, placed a $100 bill on the table beside the file, then spoke exactly one sentence. "You should go home, Josie." It was the first time in 4 months that he had called her by name. Then he walked to the door. The bell rang once. Josie remained alone beside table 19, with 200 pages of paper and an untouched glass of whiskey, and only one thought repeated itself inside her mind. For 3 years, he had waited for someone to walk through that door and question him. Yet when she finally did, he walked away, which meant that whatever was written on those 3 missing pages wasn't something he wanted to hide from her. It was something he couldn't bear to say aloud. Josie didn't go to bed that night. She returned to the apartment, set the file down on the kitchen floor, then lowered herself beside it with her back against the cabinet doors, and she remained there until the light beyond the window changed from black to gray. She pulled out page 40, rested it across her knees, and read the sentence more times than she could count. He went back in on his own. No one told him to do it. For 3 years, her anger had possessed a very specific and very useful shape. It had a name. It had a face she could summon whenever the emptiness became too much to bear. Every time she woke at 3 o'clock in the morning and reached across to the vacant half of the bed, she thought of that name, and the anger rose inside her, warm and powerful, strong enough to push her upright. Every time someone she knew asked how she had been doing lately, the anger gave her an answer. Every time she stood before the wooden board covered in pinned documents at midnight, she didn't have to confront the fact that her husband was dead. She only had to confront the fact that she hadn't found the evidence yet. Those were 2 entirely different things, and it wasn't until that night, sitting on the cold kitchen floor, that Josie finally saw the difference between them. For 3 years, she had fed her anger the way someone keeps a lamp burning in a room, not because there was anything they needed to see, but because they couldn't bear to sit in the darkness. Now the lamp was still burning, but it was shining against an empty wall. She thought about Owen. She thought about the man she had shared 7 years with. The man who abandoned dinner halfway through to help a neighbor repair a leaking pipe. The man who stopped the car in the middle of the Key Bridge to lift an injured dog into the back seat. The man she had told more than once, half laughing as she said it, that one day that nature of his was going to get him killed. She had said those words. She remembered saying them in the kitchen with her hands in the dishwater, her voice half teasing and half serious, and he had laughed. Josie wrapped both hands around her head. She had spent 3 years searching for the person who had pushed her husband toward his death, and the answer was that there had been no one, no villain, only a man who had reached safety, seen his fellow firefighter waving him over, then turned his head and ran back inside of his own free will, because that was who he was, because that was the very reason she had loved him. And the next thought came more slowly. It arrived when dawn had already begun to break, and it made her curl inward on the kitchen floor. If no one was responsible, then the only person left for her to be angry with was Owen himself, the man who had been given a choice and hadn't chosen her. Josie sat with that thought for a long time, and it felt so shameful that she couldn't bring herself to say it aloud, even though there was no one else in the apartment. For 3 years, she had clung to Elias Marchetti with both hands, not because she truly believed he was guilty, but because as long as he existed, she didn't have to be angry with her husband. She fell asleep on the floor for about an hour and woke to the sound of a ship's horn from the bay. That morning, she arrived at the tavern early to receive a delivery, and just after the woman from the bakery left, the door opened. The man who entered was somewhere past 60, dressed in a gray wool coat and a felt hat, holding an umbrella even though it wasn't raining. He removed his hat as he crossed the threshold, the habit of another generation. He ordered black coffee. Then, instead of sitting at the bar, he walked to a table in the middle of the room, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Then he looked at Josie and pointed to the chair across from him. Josie brought the coffee over and sat, and she didn't understand why she obeyed. He introduced himself as Gino Barsanti. He said he had worked for the Marchetti family since before Elias could walk, that he had held the boy in his arms at his baptism, and that he was the only person still alive who was permitted to tell him things he didn't want to hear. He said all of it in a gentle, courteous, almost warm voice, and Josie felt a chill move down her spine. Then he asked whether she knew how Elias had lived during the past 3 years. He didn't wait for an answer. He said there were people in their world who had been waiting 3 years to watch him fall, that a man who sat in the same place for 40 minutes every night, with his back to the door and no one beside him, was a man inviting disaster, and that the only reason nothing had happened yet was because, until recently, he had remained alert. He took a sip of coffee, set the cup down very softly, then said the rest. He said that during the past 4 months, Elias had begun arriving 1 minute late. He said that the previous week, Elias had risen and left the table, while his whiskey remained untouched, something that hadn't happened once in 3 years. He said Elias was distracted, and in their world, distraction wasn't a bad habit. Distraction was what got people killed. Josie opened her mouth to speak, but Gino Barsanti lifted one hand slightly, and she fell silent. He said he wasn't threatening her, that he was too old for such things and that she wasn't important enough for him to trouble himself that much. He had only come to tell her the cost of what she was doing, because he suspected no one had told her yet, and because he believed she deserved to know in advance. Then he stood, replaced his hat, and left exactly enough money on the table to pay for 1 black coffee, not a penny more, without a tip. He walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped, and Josie looked up, waiting for him to deliver one final sentence, the sort of sentence men like him always spoke in movies. But Gino Barsanti only glanced at her, adjusted his hat, and stepped outside, leaving the door to close softly behind him. And it was that silence that left Josie sitting alone in the middle of the tavern with both hands wrapped around someone else's cold coffee cup. And for the first time in 4 months, she was afraid. Josie had heard the name Augie Palumbo only once before that night. It had been on a crowded Friday evening, when 2 men sitting at the far end of the bar spoke to each other in voices low enough that no one should have heard them except the woman polishing glasses less than an arm's length away. One of them said old Augie had been going all over the harbor telling people that the boss was too busy teaching children how to build boats now. The other told him to shut up. The first man laughed and said that for 3 years Elias had done nothing but sit there drinking and staring through a window, and even the most patient people eventually got tired of waiting. Josie had written the name in the notebook beneath her drawer, just as she recorded everything else, then forgotten about it. At 4 o'clock on Tuesday morning, her telephone rang. It was the silver-haired woman from the workshop, the one who had handed Josie her first sheet of sandpaper, and she couldn't finish a complete sentence. She only said there had been a fire, that the workshop was burning, and Josie was out the door before she had even changed her clothes. She ran the final 4 blocks because the taxi couldn't get through. By the time she arrived, the flames had been out for more than an hour. 2 fire engines still blocked the entrance. The hoses had already been rolled, and the soaked pavement reflected the slow-turning red lights. The entire left half of the warehouse had burned away. The metal roof had collapsed into a twisted mass. A large section of the wooden wall dividing the 2 halves had been burned through. The other side remained standing, blackened and drenched. Josie stood behind the barricade and heard one firefighter tell another that they were lucky the doors had been locked, that no one had been inside, and that there were no homes in that part of the harbor at night. Her knees nearly gave way. The 2 children who had sat in the sawdust the night before arguing over whose boat would float longer had gone home that afternoon. The workshop always locked its doors at 11 o'clock. She repeated that sentence 3 times in her mind like a prayer. Elias arrived as dawn was beginning to break. The black car stopped at the end of the street, and he walked the remaining distance, his cane striking the wet pavement in slow, even beats. 4 or 5 men were already waiting there, and Josie noticed that every one of them fell silent as he passed. He didn't ask a single question. He stepped beneath the police tape, walked straight into the center of the ruins, and stood there for a long time, staring at the unfinished boat frame, now nothing more than a blackened curve of ribs reaching toward the sky. He didn't shout. He didn't kick anything. He didn't raise his voice even once, and that was precisely why none of the men behind him dared to move. Gino Barsanti came forward and stood beside him, holding his felt hat in one hand. Josie was about 20 paces away and couldn't hear what they said. She only saw Elias tilt his head toward the old man and speak one very brief sentence, shorter than a single breath. Gino nodded once. Then Elias turned away. That was all that happened. From that evening onward, no one in the harbor district mentioned the name Augie Palumbo again. There was no news, no announcement. The same 2 men still sat at the far end of the bar on Friday nights and still talked, but the name disappeared from their conversations as though it had never existed. And when Josie casually mentioned it to Maud once, the older woman gave her a swift look and continued stacking glasses. Josie understood that there were some things in this city a person was better off not asking about. She returned to the workshop the following afternoon after the police had removed the barricades. She had come to retrieve the coat she had left behind the previous week, or at least that was what she told herself. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the collapsed section of roof, and in the middle of that pale shaft of light sat a man. Elias was seated on a half-burned length of timber without his coat, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his cane lying on the ground beside him. A canvas tarp had been spread out in front of him, and about 20 objects had already been arranged across it. He was bent over, searching through the ash and twisted scraps of metal. Josie stood in the doorway and watched him for nearly a minute before he noticed her. He lifted a burned board, brushed aside the ash beneath it, and pulled out a woodworking plane. He wiped it clean with his sleeve, turned it from side to side to see whether the blade could still be used, then placed it neatly on the tarp beside the other planes. Then he bent down and began searching again. She saw his hands. They were black with soot, and red marks crossed his knuckles, some of them already dried into dark lines where the skin had bled. Josie walked toward him. She said his name. He looked up, and she saw a streak of ash running across one cheekbone. She asked whether he knew his hands were bleeding. He looked down at them as though she had just informed him about someone else's property, then said it was nothing. Josie knelt beside the tarp. There were planes, chisels, dividers, an iron awl, several wooden bending forms warped by the heat, and 2 small wooden boats the size of a hand, each scorched along one side, their cloth sails burned to ash. She picked one up. She asked what he was doing. Elias said good tools could be replaced, but several of the chisels had belonged to his grandfather, and the dividers had belonged to the craftsman who taught him, a man who had died 7 years earlier. He said the rest could be left behind, but those were the things he wanted to find. Josie set the scorched boat down. She looked around the ruined workshop, at the man sitting there on a Wednesday afternoon digging through ashes with his bare hands, and she thought of the 2 children who had cried out with delight over their boats the night before. She thought of the man with the crutches. She thought of the silver-haired woman whose son had once spent 4 months refusing to leave his room. Then she took off her coat, folded it, placed it on a piece of timber, and knelt beside him. She said that if he showed her what the dividers looked like, she could help him find them faster. Elias didn't say anything. He only pulled the tarp slightly closer to her, and together they searched through the ashes until darkness had completely fallen. It wasn't until late that night, when she was home washing her hands beneath the faucet and watching black water circle down the drain, that Josie realized something she hadn't had time to consider all afternoon. That fire had been deliberately set. Someone had burned the workshop because Elias had grown soft, and everyone in the harbor knew exactly when that softness had begun. It had begun 4 months earlier. The following morning, the silver-haired woman called Josie for the 2nd time. She said Elias had gone to Mercy Hospital early because a cut in the palm of his right hand had become infected, and she added that she was calling Josie instead of anyone else, though she didn't explain why. Josie arrived shortly before noon. He was sitting in a plastic chair in a treatment room while a nurse wrapped the final layer of bandage around his right hand, and his cane stood in the corner against the wall. He saw her in the doorway and didn't ask how she knew. The nurse left. Josie pulled over the other chair and sat facing him, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Then she asked the same question again. She asked very softly, without pressure in her voice, nothing like the night at the tavern when she had slammed the entire file onto the table. She simply asked what he had said to her husband before Owen went back inside. Elias looked down at his bandaged hand. Then he began to speak, and his voice was unlike anything Josie had ever heard from him. Lower, flatter. The voice of a man reciting something he had memorized but had never once spoken aloud. He said he hadn't said anything to her husband. He said he couldn't speak at the time. Then he told her what had happened. He had gone to the Pier 7 warehouse that night because Nico called and said there was a problem with the shipment, and Elias went down there instead of telling his brother to go home because he thought it would be handled quickly. He entered through the eastern door. The fire started on the western side, in the solvent storage area, and it spread faster than anything he had ever seen. By the time he turned back to look for Nico, the section of roof above the central corridor had already begun to sag. A beam came down across his right leg, pinning him to the concrete floor. He said he lay there for 4 or 5 minutes. He said the smoke was still thin enough near the floor to breathe, but only for a little while. He said he had already accepted that it was over. Then someone appeared through the smoke. Elias couldn't see the man's face clearly because of the mask visor and the darkness. The man knelt, tried twice to lift the beam, and failed. Then he did something whose meaning Elias wouldn't fully understand until much later. He removed his own breathing mask and placed it over Elias's face. Elias stopped there. Josie sat without moving. She heard a cart rolling through the hallway outside, someone calling a doctor's name over the loudspeaker, and all those sounds seemed very far away. He continued. He said the man braced both feet against the beam, and on the third attempt, it shifted by about a handspan, just enough to pull Elias free. Then the man wrapped an arm across his chest and dragged him down the corridor, and Elias said he didn't know how long the distance was. He only remembered looking upward and watching the ceiling pass above him in sections, one after another. Once they were outside, the man lowered him onto the concrete for 2 paramedics who were running toward them. Elias paused longer at that point. Then he said that was when he finally saw him clearly. He said he was lying on his back with the mask over his face, looking up at a firefighter standing above him with his face uncovered, nothing protecting it, struggling to breathe. He said the firefighter looked down at him for about a second, then raised a hand to the left side of his chest where the mask hose should have been, and Elias watched him realize what he had done. Then the firefighter turned his head toward the warehouse entrance. Elias said he tried to lift his hand. He said he tried to speak, but his mouth was covered by the very mask the firefighter had given him, and no sound came out. He said the man ran back inside with an air tank that was nearly empty, and that was the last thing Elias saw before losing consciousness. He looked up at Josie for the first time since he began telling the story. He said, "He didn't go back in for my brother. He didn't know whether anyone was still inside. He went back because he had just realized he had given his own air to a stranger, and he believed he still had time to finish doing his job." Then he said the words Josie would carry with her for the rest of her life. "For 3 years, I have been alive because I have been breathing the air that belonged to your husband." Josie raised a hand to cover her mouth. She didn't cry aloud. She only sat there while her shoulders trembled in short waves. And Elias didn't reach for her or offer a single word of comfort, because he understood that there were no words that could be used here. A long time later, she asked why the 3 pages had been removed. He said they contained his own statement, taken at the hospital 9 days after the fire. He said he had told the story exactly as he had just told it to her, that the investigator had written down every detail, and that the statement had never been included in the city's official file, because both the insurance company and the department decided that an accidental fire was a cleaner conclusion for everyone. He said he hadn't kept those 3 pages to hide them from her. He had kept them because he wanted her to read the other 200 pages first. He wanted her to reach that place on her own, step by step, so that when he finally spoke, she would believe him. Then he added that if he had given her those 3 pages from the beginning, she would have thought he had invented the story to defend himself, and he said he couldn't bear that thought. Josie asked why he had sat at that table for 3 years. Elias looked out the hospital room window. He said Engine 19 was directly across the street. He said that every night for 3 years, he had sat there with his back to the door, so that anyone from that station, one of Owen's friends, one of his brothers, or someone from his family, could look through the window, see him, and know exactly where and when to find him. He said he had spent 3 years waiting for someone to cross the street and make him pay that price. He hadn't been waiting to be forgiven. He had been waiting for someone to collect the debt. Then he looked at Josie and spoke the final words very softly. "And the person who crossed the street was you." It was already dark when Josie reached her apartment. She stood before the wooden board in the bedroom, the board she had dusted every week for 3 years, and looked at it for a long time. Then she took it down from the wall. She removed every newspaper clipping, every page of the report, and every receipt marked with black ink, and carried all of it into the small courtyard behind the building, a space barely large enough for 2 sleeping mats. She placed everything inside the metal barrel the elderly men downstairs used for burning leaves. She struck a match. She stood and watched 3 years of her life burn away, and she didn't feel relieved, nor did she feel pain. She only felt empty, the kind of emptiness left inside a room after all the furniture has been removed, and no one yet knows how it will be arranged again. She kept only one thing. In her hands as she climbed the stairs was the wedding photograph taken on the church steps one June afternoon. She carried it into the bedroom, placed it on the bedside table facing outward, and this time, she didn't put it away again. 3 days after the hospital, Elias didn't come to the tavern. Josie still poured the whiskey at 9:38, and at the end of her shift, she still emptied it down the drain. But this time, she wasn't worried. She understood why. There were things that, once spoken aloud for the first time, required a few days for a person to learn how to live with having said them. By Saturday night, she asked Maud, and Maud stopped in the middle of rearranging the liquor shelf. She said tomorrow was Sunday, and on Sundays Josie shouldn't wait. Josie asked why. Maud said she had kept the tavern open 7 days a week for 3 years, and among those 7 days there was exactly one when he never came. She said nothing more. On Sunday morning, Josie woke early and took the bus to Greenmount Cemetery. She walked along the 2 main paths and asked the groundskeeper, who directed her to the Marchetti family plot on the eastern side beneath a row of oak trees. She found the headstone bearing Nico Marchetti's name quickly. There were flowers there, still fresh, but no one was present, and the grass around the grave lay smooth, without the footprints of anyone who had recently visited. Josie stood there for about 10 minutes, then walked to the western section, where Owen was buried. She sat on the grass beside her husband's headstone for the first time in nearly a year, and she remained there for a long while without saying anything. Around noon, it began to rain. She took the bus home, and when it turned onto Thames Street, she looked through the window out of habit toward the familiar tavern, and saw something that made her press the stop button and get off at the next corner. Across the street from the Copper Lantern, on the sidewalk before the row of old buildings, a man stood in the rain. No umbrella, no hat. The shoulders of his dark wool coat were soaked through. One hand rested on a walnut cane, while the other hung at his side. He stood facing Engine 19, where the red rolling door was rising, and 3 firefighters were washing the truck in the front bay, the hiss of the hose and the sound of their laughter carrying all the way to the opposite sidewalk. Josie walked back 2 blocks. She approached from behind and stopped about 3 steps away, and though he didn't turn, she knew he had heard her. She asked how long he had been standing there. He said since around 9 o'clock. It was nearly 1 in the afternoon. Josie stepped forward and stood beside him, turning toward the other side of the street as well. Rainwater ran down the back of her neck and soaked into her collar, but she didn't move. She asked whether he came there every Sunday. He said he had for 3 years. She asked why Sunday. He said Sunday was the day the duty crew washed the trucks and left the doors open, when people from the neighborhood often brought their children to watch, and the rolling door remained raised throughout the morning. He said that if there were ever a day when crossing the street should have been easy, it was that day. Josie looked across. The road was only 2 lanes wide with a painted line between them, fewer than 10 steps. 3 years. She asked why he hadn't crossed. Elias remained silent for a long time. Then he said that once, during the first winter, he had made it halfway across. He had stood on the painted line for about half a minute, then turned back. He said he hadn't tried again since. Josie asked why. And the man whom everyone in the harbor district lowered their eyes around, the man whose quiet sentence could make a name disappear from the city, answered her in the voice of someone who was very tired. He said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to say to them." He said, "I have practiced that sentence for 3 years, and I have never once managed to finish it. I cross the street. Then what? I knock on the door and say I'm the man Bright gave his mask to. Do whatever you want with me. Then what? They will look at me. Some of them will forgive me, and that will be worse. Some of them won't, and I will have to stand there and accept it. But I will feel relieved because someone is finally punishing me, and then it will mean I didn't cross the street for them at all. I crossed it for myself. When he finished, he fell silent, and Josie saw his shoulders lower. She stood beside him in the rain without speaking for a long time. Across the street, one firefighter shut off the hose and began coiling it, while the three of them lowered the rolling door halfway to keep the rain from blowing inside. Their laughter still carried through the air. Josie thought about her own 3 years, about the wooden board that had burned inside the metal barrel in the courtyard, about the drawer she hadn't dared to open, about how she too had stood at the edge of something for 3 years without finding the courage to step inside. She thought that if someone had said one sentence to her during one of those nights, perhaps the 3 years would have felt shorter. Then she spoke, her voice so soft it was almost lost beneath the rain. "Then don't say anything." Elias turned to look at her. She continued staring across the street. She said he didn't owe them a speech. He didn't owe them an apology, with every word arranged perfectly. Then she spoke the last sentence. "Just don't stand here alone anymore." The rain grew heavier. Neither of them crossed the street that day. They only stood there for another 10 minutes or so, side by side, looking in the same direction, and when Elias finally turned away, Josie turned with him, and they walked slowly toward the tavern in time, with the steady rhythm of his cane. Outside the copper lantern, he stopped and thanked her. She said tomorrow was Monday, 9:40. He said he knew. Then he added something Josie hadn't expected, something that left her standing motionless on the sidewalk, long after he had disappeared from sight. He said he wouldn't come there the following Sunday. He said he was going somewhere else, and he asked whether she wanted to go with him. Josie had said yes, and throughout that entire week, she had no idea where she had agreed to go. She only asked what time, and he said 10 o'clock in the morning at the eastern gate of Greenmount Cemetery. Sunday dawned clear beneath the pale autumn sunlight of Baltimore, and by the time Josie arrived, he was already there. He wasn't waiting at the gate. She followed the path she had taken the week before, turned toward the row of oak trees in the eastern section, and saw him from a distance. He was sitting on the grass before the headstone bearing the name Nico Marchetti, not on the stone bench only a few steps away, but directly on the ground, one leg stretched out because his knee wouldn't bend. His cane lay beside him, and on the grass before the headstone stood a low glass filled with whiskey. No ice. Beside the glass was a small piece of paper folded into quarters. Josie stopped about 20 paces away and went no farther. She watched him pick up the paper, unfold it, and read. Even from that distance, she knew what it was. She had held 38 pieces of paper exactly like it over the past 4 months, but this one was different. There was no black stain of ink across it. No line had been covered over. No place where the pen had pressed hard enough to tear the paper. There was only one sentence, written once and left untouched. He read it for several seconds, then folded it again, placed it on the grass, and set the whiskey glass on top of it to hold it down. Then he did nothing else. He only sat there with both hands resting on his knees, looking at the headstone, so still that from a distance he seemed like part of the cemetery itself. Josie turned away. She walked back toward the gate and crossed to the small shop on the other side of the road, where they sold coffee and flowers to cemetery visitors, and she stood at the counter for a while before deciding. She asked the woman behind the counter whether they sold liquor. The woman said they carried small bottles for people who wanted to pour a drink for someone they had lost. Josie bought one small bottle and a paper cup, then stood on the sidewalk and poured the whiskey about 2 fingers deep, exactly the amount she had poured for Elias every night for 4 months. She walked back inside the cemetery. She moved slowly, so he would hear her footsteps on the gravel from a distance, and by the time she reached him, he already knew it was her, though he didn't turn around. Josie sat on the grass. She didn't sit close beside him. She didn't sit far away either. She settled about an arm's length from him, close enough for him to know someone was there and far enough that he wouldn't feel crowded. Then she reached out and placed the paper cup on the grass beside his glass, directly before the headstone. The 2 drinks stood side by side. For a long while she said nothing. Church bells sounded somewhere near Greenmount Avenue, and a wind moved through the oak trees, scattering several dry leaves across the grass. Then Josie spoke a single sentence. "Don't drink alone anymore." Elias didn't answer. She didn't wait for him to. She stood, brushed the grass from the cuffs of her pants, and walked westward along the rows of headstones, passing 3 lines of graves, before stopping in front of a white stone, engraved with 1 name and 2 dates, separated by 31 years. She knelt. She placed her hand against the stone, over the carved name, and the surface felt cold beneath her palm. During the past 3 years, she had come there fewer than 10 times, and each time she had only stood in silence. She had never said a word to him, because she hadn't known where to begin, when the only thing she wanted to say was a question. And that question was, why didn't you think of me? Today, she didn't ask it. She spoke softly, in the voice someone might use while talking to another person in the kitchen in the morning. I know now. I know why you went back inside. For 3 years, I kept believing someone made you do it, and I searched for that person. I kept searching because I couldn't bear the thought that you had chosen it yourself. She paused and had to draw a breath. Then she said, I'm not angry with you anymore. She said it twice. The second time her voice broke, and she bent forward until her forehead touched the cold stone, and she cried there for about a minute without making a sound. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, stood, and spoke one final sentence before turning away. That part of you, the part I always said would get you killed. I was right, but if you hadn't had it, I never would have married you. Sleep well, Owen. When she returned to the row of oak trees, she saw the man's shoulders shaking. Elias was still sitting in the same position, one leg stretched out, both hands resting on his knees, his face turned toward the headstone. But his shoulders trembled in short waves, and he lifted his bandaged hand to cover his face. There was no sound. That man cried the way someone cries after spending 3 years teaching himself not to make a noise. Josie sat down again in the same place, an arm's length away, and she didn't reach out to touch him. She didn't tell him everything was all right. She didn't tell him to stop blaming himself. She didn't say any of the things people had said to her for 3 years, none of which had ever helped. She simply sat there, facing forward, and let him cry, because she had finally understood something that had taken her 3 years to learn. What people needed wasn't someone to come and repair their pain, because pain like that couldn't be repaired. What they needed was someone willing to sit beside it without walking away. Elias wasn't crying because someone had reminded him of his younger brother. He hadn't forgotten him for a single day. He was crying because for the first time in 3 years, he didn't have to sit alone on that grass. The sun climbed higher. The 2 drinks remained side by side before the headstone, one in glass and one in paper. A long time later, he lowered his hand, released a deep breath, and said in a voice rough with tears that he was sorry. Josie told him he didn't need to apologize to her for that. Then they sat there a while longer, until the shadows of the oak trees leaned toward the east. Before leaving, Elias braced himself on his cane and stood, bent down, and picked up both cups, his own glass and her paper one, holding them together in one hand. He looked at the headstone bearing his brother's name and said softly that he would come back the following Sunday. Then he added one more sentence, even more quietly, and Josie, standing an arm's length away, heard every word. Next time, I won't come alone. The rebuilding of the warehouse began on a Saturday morning, and no one officially organized it. The silver-haired woman sent messages to a few people. Those people contacted a few more, and by 7 o'clock in the morning, more than 30 people had gathered outside the workshop. 2 contractor brothers from Aliciana Street arrived with a truckload of lumber and said plainly that they wouldn't accept payment. 3 forklift drivers from the docks took the morning shift off. The owner of the bakery on the corner arrived at 6 o'clock with 2 large containers of coffee and a tray of sandwiches, and every 2 hours she returned to bring more. The man with the crutches sat in a plastic chair in the middle of the yard. He couldn't raise any posts, but he held the plans and directed everyone throughout the day, and not one person argued with him. Elias worked from morning until afternoon, and Josie noticed that among all those people crowding the yard, no one called him boss, no one stood when he walked past, and no one lowered their voice. Inside that wooden fence, he was only the man who knew how to assemble the ribs of a boat. By noon, the 2 children from before had returned, bringing 2 more with them, and the 4 of them were assigned the job of repainting an old boat that had been rescued from the fire. What had to happen happened. One child wanted to paint it blue, because a boat should look like the sea. Another wanted red, because red could be seen from far away. The third suggested painting half of it blue and half red, and the other 3 objected at once. The argument lasted nearly half an hour. There was a referee, there was a vote, and one child became offended and went outside to sit on the steps, only to return on his own 2 minutes later. In the end, the man with the crutches ruled that the hull would be blue with red trim, and all 4 children cheered as though they had just won a court case. They painted all morning, getting paint on their hands and in one another's hair, and their laughter rang through the yard filled with sawdust and the scent of fresh lumber. Josie stood at the coffee table pouring drinks for everyone, and at one point she raised her head and looked across the yard, at the people setting the posts, at the children arguing over paint colors, at the man with the cane kneeling on one knee to fasten screws into the base of a workbench, and she felt something warm rise inside her chest, something whose name she had forgotten during the past 3 years. Within 2 weeks, the workshop was standing again. It was uglier than the old one, with a patched metal roof and a black burn mark still covering one wall, which Elias said they should leave untouched instead of painting over. But it was larger, and he had 4 additional workbenches placed in the newly cleared space. He told the silver-haired woman that from then on, they would accept more students from the fire department who had been forced to leave the profession because of injuries, and he didn't explain why. The woman didn't ask. By the 3rd week, a local newspaper sent someone to write a brief article for the community section, accompanied by a photograph of the children standing beside the blue boat with red trim. The article didn't mention the Marchetti name. Elias had insisted on that. On Thursday afternoon that week, he arrived at the tavern earlier than usual, before the room had begun to fill. He didn't go to his usual corner. He stood at the bar and placed a small paper box, about the size of a hand, on the wooden counter. Josie wiped her hands on her apron and opened it. Inside, resting on a layer of cloth, was a tarnished metal nameplate, its edges curled from the heat, though the raised lettering remained clearly legible. Bright. Josie stood motionless. She recognized it immediately. It was the plate that had been attached to the back rim of Owen's helmet, the helmet she had polished with her own hands on the night before his first shift with Engine 19, the helmet that hadn't been returned to her with his other belongings. Elias said very quietly that when they pulled him out, the plate had been lying on the concrete beside him, and a paramedic had picked it up and placed it with his wallet and telephone among his personal effects. He said he had found it 3 days later at the hospital. He said it had remained in the drawer of his desk for 3 years. Then he spoke the final words, and his voice wasn't as steady as it usually was. "It belongs to you. It should have belonged to you a long time ago, and I had no reason to keep it except that I wasn't brave enough to bring it to your door." Josie lifted the nameplate, and it was heavier than she had expected. She closed her hand tightly around it and couldn't say anything. She only nodded. Elias nodded as well, then went to table 19, and that night he drank very slowly. The following afternoon, Josie was sitting at the kitchen table when her telephone vibrated. She opened the message and became perfectly still. It was a letter from an emergency medical technician training program at a hospital in Chicago, a program she had applied to 11 months earlier during a sleepless night, then forgotten about because she hadn't believed she stood a chance. She had been accepted. The course would begin in 3 weeks. She read the letter 3 times, then placed the telephone face down on the table and sat for a long while staring out the window. 3 weeks. For the past 3 years, she had possessed only one purpose in that city, and that purpose had ended on the grass at Green Mount the previous Sunday. Now someone had opened a door for her in a place 700 miles away, just as she had finally found a reason to stay. That same afternoon, at the waterfront office, Gino Barsanti placed a thin file on Elias's desk. He said he had ordered a complete investigation from the beginning, as he always did with anyone who came close. He said that 8 months earlier, a law office on Charles Street had prepared a civil lawsuit on behalf of Mrs. Josephine Bright against the Marchetti family concerning the night of November 14th. He said the paperwork was complete and required only her signature. He said it had never been withdrawn, that it remained valid within the time left under the statute of limitations, and that with the 200-page file Elias had placed in her hands, himself, it was no longer a hopeless lawsuit. Elias picked up the file. He read every page slowly, from beginning to end. Then he closed it and pushed it back toward Gino. The old man asked what he intended to do. Elias looked through the window toward the gray surface of the bay and said to leave it alone. Gino said she could take a great many things from him. Elias said that if she wanted to take them, they had belonged to her from the beginning anyway. The old man stood there for a moment, then picked up the file, put on his hat, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and said that in 3 years he had never heard Elias say anything more foolish, and he had never seen him resemble his father more closely. Then he left. During those final 3 weeks, neither of them mentioned Chicago. They talked about wood, about paint, about how the bakery owner had burned 2 batches in a row because she had been too busy watching the roof being repaired. One afternoon at the workshop, a former firefighter who had just joined the class tightened a screw too hard, sending it flying toward the ceiling before it vanished. And everyone in the workshop abandoned their work to search for it for 15 minutes, turning over piles of sawdust and shining lights beneath the workbenches, until Maud, who had stopped by to bring everyone sandwiches, reached into her purse for her keys and pulled out the missing screw. She had carried it around the entire workshop all afternoon without knowing it. The whole warehouse collapsed into laughter, and Josie looked over and saw Elias turn his face away to wipe tears from his eyes, while the man with the crutches called out that he hadn't heard him laugh that loudly in 3 years. Then there was the evening Elias came to help her pack. The apartment slowly emptied, and the two of them fought over the old coffee maker. She insisted it belonged with the kitchen things. He said it had a glass interior and needed to be packed with the fragile items. She said it made coffee, so it was a kitchen item. He said anything with electricity wasn't a kitchen item. Neither of them let go. The box beneath them tilted, and another box toppled with it. The one Josie had labeled medical records in black marker, so the neighbors wouldn't become curious. Cookies spilled across the floor. Her mother had sent them from Ohio 3 days earlier. The two of them sat down amid the crumbs, and laughed so hard that neither could manage to pick anything up. He said it was the most dishonest thing he had ever seen her do. She said she was learning quickly. During the final week, Nico's unfinished wooden boat was completed. It had remained beneath a tarp in the corner of the workshop for 3 years, and during those 3 years no one had been permitted to touch it. Elias fitted the final section of the hull with his own hands, polished it, then took a small chisel and carved a word into the right side. Josie arrived at the workshop late that afternoon and saw it. Bright. She stood there for a long time. He said nothing, only handed her a cloth and a jar of varnish, and the two of them polished the boat together until darkness fell. On her final night in Baltimore, Josie worked her shift as usual. At 9:40, the bell rang. Whiskey without ice. Table 19. She carried the glass over, set it down, and placed the receipt beside it. Elias instinctively reached into the inner pocket of his coat for his pen, then stopped. He looked down at the table. For 3 years, a ballpoint pen had been placed beside the paper every night, first by Maud, and for the past 4 months by Josie. That night, there was no pen. He looked up and asked whether there wasn't a pen tonight. Josie stood beside the table, holding the tray against her chest, and said she didn't think he needed one anymore. Elias looked at the blank piece of paper before him. Then he picked it up, folded it in half, and slipped it into his pocket without writing a single word. For the first time in 3 years, he remained for the full 40 minutes, finished his whiskey, placed a $100 bill on the table, then used his cane to rise. As he neared the door, Josie called his name. He stopped and turned. She walked over, handed him a second receipt, and told him to turn it over. He did. On the back was her handwriting, slow and careful. "Thank you for staying. Now let someone stay for you." Beneath the receipt, folded into quarters, was another sheet of paper. He opened it and found a signed withdrawal of the civil claim, bearing the seal of the Charles Street Law Office, and dated 2 weeks earlier. He held the 2 papers in his hands and couldn't speak. He opened his mouth twice, then gave up. Josie smiled through reddened eyes and said it had taken her 4 months to understand why he kept writing on those slips of paper, and now it was her turn. He only nodded, because the deepest promises don't always need language. 3 days later, he stood near the departure gates at Baltimore-Washington International Airport until her plane disappeared completely into the clouds. He didn't run after her. He didn't say anything to make her stay. Because loving someone doesn't mean asking them to abandon their dream. It means believing that your place in their story will still be there when they finish writing this chapter. Then he returned home. And the next morning he opened the workshop as he did every day. 6 months later, winter had settled over Chicago. Josie had just finished a 12-hour shift, her legs aching and her hair disheveled, when she stopped at a small tavern across the street from the hospital. Out of habit, she ordered a single neat whiskey. The young woman behind the counter looked at the screen, then raised her eyes and said someone had already paid for it, and handed Josie the receipt. Josie turned it over. She knew that handwriting by heart from 38 pieces of paper. This time, 2 glasses. She turned around. He was standing near the door, and he looked entirely different, stronger through the body, straighter through the back, his face no longer carrying the pallor of sleepless nights. The cane was still in his hand. That leg would never heal, and he knew it, but it no longer decided the way he walked. He came to stand before her and said that this time she was allowed to thank him. Josie laughed through 2 streams of tears, took his hand, and said no. Today I only want to sit and have a drink with you. They sat at a table beside the window, not table 19, because a new city deserved a beginning of its own. By spring, Josie had become a certified emergency medical technician, and the Baltimore Boat Workshop had opened a second location. They kept one habit. Sunday mornings, a small cafe, a table beside the window. One morning, she arrived late because of an overnight shift, and he said he had been waiting. The server brought their coffee and left the receipt on the table. For the first time in more than a year, Elias took out a pen. Josie smiled and said it had been a long time since she had seen him write on one of those. He said this one was different. Then he handed it to her. On the back was a single sentence. "Would you like to keep this habit with me for the rest of our lives?" Before she could answer, he opened a small wooden box, the kind he had built himself at the workshop, and inside was a plain ring engraved with one word: stay. Josie took that same pen from his hand and wrote beneath his question, "Only if you never drink alone again." Then she looked up and said, "I think that means yes." Before they left the cafe, he took an old notebook from his pocket, filled with receipts from 3 years, every one of them covered in black ink. He looked at them one final time, then closed the notebook and said he didn't need to write those things anymore. Josie slipped her hand into his and said he never had. Some wounds don't heal with time. Some regrets don't disappear simply because someone says it wasn't your fault. But perhaps this story reminds us that what binds people for the longest time is often not the pain itself, but the anger we nurture, so we won't have to sit down and face that pain. And the strongest person isn't the one who never falls. It is the one who carries a wound no one can see and still opens the door and steps into the street every morning. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with advice or consolation. Sometimes it begins with a familiar chair, a glass of whiskey, a small piece of paper, and someone willing to sit beside you without walking away. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button and share this video with anyone you believe may also need to feel heard. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day, more warm and meaningful stories can accompany you. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, and which moment moved you the most. The second glass placed on the cemetery grass, the receipt no one needed to write on anymore, or simply the fact that at last, someone chose to stay. Please leave a few words in the comments so we may listen to the deepest thoughts within your heart. We wish you lasting health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.